What's up, gangsters? How about some Spitfire action? Some Spitfire action that does not involve the cockpit now after like 10 episodes of that nonsense. Yeah, like I've said, I know that seems a little disproportionate, but look, it is what it is. For aircraft model makers, the cockpit is, one of the most intense parts of the project. And, of course, the irony is that so little of it gets seen after the fact. But I feel like that was all good because it involved, all of the fundamental skills, some of which are going to get put to work on the outside of the thing, which now, finally, I can move on to. So this segment is going to involve all of the basic, rough, if you want to call it that, body work to get this thing together. So let's just get right to it. Okay, so here we are picking up where I left off, complete with bumping into the camera. Continuity is a good thing, right? Anyway, so in the last segment, I had the fuselage glued together. And haven't done anything to it since other than adding these two little bulges that go here on the nose. Got a little cleanup to do around one of those because I spooged out a little excess cement, but not too bad. And I've got this nose piece added on here. I guess the reason that they must be doing that is to account for later versions that have some different things going on in that area of that cowling. That's going to be a little bit of a hassle to deal with the seam line, but not too bad. As you can see, let's talk about the seams, because that's the next thing that's going to get addressed. And I haven't attached the wings to this thing yet, or any of the tail feathers, because I really prefer to do my fuselage seam work with it just like this. It's just a lot easier to handle, and so that's the way I always tackle it. But let's look at what we've got. This thing went together in pretty typical Tamiya fashion, with, as you can see, a very tight seam. I did use some clamps. It wasn't perfect, but one of the reasons why I use clamps is because the ideal thing is that when you put something like this together with extra thin, and I don't really know why you would do it any other way, is so that you can put some force on it and squeeze a little bit of the molten plastic out of the joint, because right there you go, that's sprue goo, and so it's your first and best filler material if there is a slight gap there. So you can see along the spine here that I've got some of that where it's squeezed out, and that's good. But had a little bit of a gap there, and it didn't quite do it. There's also a little bit of a step there that needs to take care of. A slight misalignment, you can see. Also looks like I've got that silver piece in there, that spar that runs from back to front, looks a little bit crooked. And of course I've got to clean off the top of it. I just clipped it off the sprue and glued it in there, so I'll take care of that. This joint along the cowling is going to be the number one thing across the nose, because that's all got to be smooth. And there is a little bit of a step there, you can see that. So we're going to get to dealing with all of that here directly. And sprue goo is going to be what I will use. There really isn't going to be much of any rescribing or re-riveting, because really the only place I've got to worry about it is where it crosses the joint. I've got to preserve that, especially there on the spine and on the underside of the tail. But sprue goo is really always my first choice because it's so easy to use. It's so easy to sand and work. It takes a little bit of time to cure, But look, if I can't wait 8 hours for something, then that's a project management problem. And I feel like that a lot of people who complain about sprue goo being hard to use because it never cures, or because it's got too many bubbles or whatever, that they may just be using too much. I try to use minimum amounts of any filler, but especially with sprue goo, because, yeah, sure, if you pile it on there, it's going to take a long time. It's not going to take forever, but it is going to take a long time. And obviously, you don't want to have to wait any longer than necessary. But I've never found, the way that I use it anyway, any situation where it needed more than 8 hours before it was workable. And I'll show you, once I get this seam line cleaned up, exactly what I mean. Now, I'm tackling this with the blade first because it's just a quick and easy way to knock off that excess gunk and see what I'm dealing with. But I'm very quickly going to turn to a file. And I've talked about this in other videos. You may think, well, why would you use a file on a round surface? You're going to make a flat spot. And of course you will if you're not careful, if you're not paying attention to what you're doing. But what you can see is that as I work that, I'm rotating the piece in my hand so that I'm not just continually filing a flat spot. And you can get a lot of control with a file if you're careful, and it leaves a pretty nice smooth surface, and it's just efficient, works good. And the thing that I like about it the most is that it doesn't do a lot of excess work that you then have to go back and fix later. See, I've controlled my work to a very thin stripe along the seam there. Whereas if I immediately grab a sponge like this, yeah, it's going to conform to that, but it's also going to spread out, and it's going to do a lot more sanding than is really necessary. So that's why I don't use a sponge until towards the end of the process, and I'm using a pretty fine grit, and I know that I'm not gonna create problems for myself. Okay, so I've done my basic cleanup, and all of that I did in the same way, using the edge of a scalpel to adze it down where that was appropriate. My little bitty Suji Burrito files, which are fantastic for this kind of stuff, especially when you've got to do something like this on the cowl, and you're working between those Zeus fasteners right there. You can see you get, like I said, you just get really good control. So what this step enables me to see is kind of what I'm up against. There's a little bit of a gap there. You can't see it, so I know I'm going to come back and fill that. Same thing on the other side. There's a little bit of a gap and a little bit of a step. And speaking of a step, if I've got just a very slight one, like maybe 10 thousandths, maybe even 20 thousandths, I'll go ahead and cut it down and try and level everything out first. And that's what I did here. And that enables me to see really what I need to do as far as filler goes, so that I'm applying only the minimum amount. And you can see I still got a little bit I need to do there with some filler. That part right there leveled out pretty good. but I have a little bit of a not really a gap, but just a valley right there in the middle next to that joint with the front piece. Now I got these things cleaned up around these blisters, but there's still a little bit of fuzz there. And one thing that you can do when you've got some of that fuzz and it's hard to get in there is just get a tiny bit of extra thin on a brush and just go and just very lightly brush around that. Not a lot, because you don't want to get into actually melting anything important. You're just looking to basically dissolve the little pieces of fuzz and clean that up a little bit better. Okay, so that's what the spine looks like. Some places where I definitely need a little bit of filler. I don't know if the tail on this thing is a little bit warped or if it's the way I clamped it together or what, but there's a little bit of misalignment you can see here on the bottom. That's unfortunate, and it didn't quite come together there at the back. But it's okay. You know, I always try and chase my misalignments and gaps to the least visible area, and of course that's always going to be on the belly. So it shouldn't be too big of a deal. But that's where I'm at right there. I've got you know, like there's a few little tiny gaps there, and I will fill those in with sprue goo. But before I do that, let's talk about the other stuff, because I have also been busily working my way through assembly of all of the wing stuff, because I want to get as much of that done as possible. So here's where I'm at with the lower portion of the wing. And I skipped around in the instructions a little bit because I felt like that was appropriate. There are things like adding these little scoops on here that they say not to do until later, but there's no reason to not just go ahead and do it. And you want to not miss in the instructions where they have you drill the holes to mount those. There's one on each side. Also, you'll notice that I've got something going on with the machine guns. So what happened there was I mounted those, and I decided to try and drill them out just to see how good I was, because that's pretty hard. I mean, that thing is 0.5, 0.6 millimeter in diameter total, and it's pretty tough to get a hole drilled in the middle of it. And I did it successfully on 1 out of 2. The second one, it blew out the side and it just, ruined it. So I did what I should have done from the start, is I used some of this Albion aluminum tubing. And this stuff is just fantastic, and it's super easy to replace those guns with these. And all I really had to do, this is the This is the 0.7 millimeter tubing, and it is just a little bit wide for those two nubs that are sticking up on either side of the barrel. So you just take a little bit out of from in between those with a scalpel blade, and that piece of aluminum tubing will drop right in there. Now, how do you cut that? This is one of the things that makes this Albion aluminum tubing so wonderful. And I'll show you. I've got a couple of little tiny pieces of it here I can demonstrate with. It's basically dead soft aluminum, and at least as far as I can tell, so it cuts pretty easily. And the way that I do that is, and I'm gonna try the zoom in thing here. Hold on a second. Okay, hopefully I can do this. All right, so what you want to do is just get a sharp blade, and I like this number 22 scalpel blade for this because the round profile makes it easy. And you're going to just roll it back and forth until it cuts. And if I can keep from bumping into the camera, you'll see that. So you can see it chops right through there. And you kind of have to practice so that you don't end up with a bit hanging off of there. But the reason that that's like that, and it's a shitty cut, is because I was rolling crooked. So how do you avoid that? And this is where a nice shiny scalpel blade comes in handy. And this is an old woodworker's trick. So what you do is, if you look, see when you put your blade down there, the tubing is reflected in the blade. If the reflection is not perfectly lined up, your blade is crooked. So what you do is you just rotate your hand until you know that the blade is straight up and down and the reflection is straight, and you start rolling back and forth and try to roll it a full 360 degrees. And when you do, look at that, you get that nice clean little cut. And if you have a little bit of a burr, you can just knock it off with like a 400 grit sanding stick. So nice and so easy for gun barrels, hose fittings, any place you need miniature tubing. That aluminum stuff is fantastic, and especially because for a lot of things it's already the right color and has a natural metallic finish. So super good stuff. All right, let me fix the camera back and we'll continue. Okay, so I've got these scoops all assembled up, and one thing to watch out for, especially if you just move too fast and you're an idiot like me, is when you are putting the photo etch inside this sub-assembly here, make sure you actually put the photo etch on that piece before you stick it to the other piece. Because if you don't, the photo etch piece does not want to slide in there. See, it's got a slot there, an oval slot in that placement tab, and that actually fits on a protrusion there on the underside of that piece. So yeah, if you screw up and don't do that, you just, clip the tab off the end of the photo etch piece, like me, and shove it in there, and hopefully everything will be fine. So anyway, I will squirt some aluminum paint inside those before I glue them on the bottoms of the bottom of the wing, but they will definitely go on there before the wing goes on, or certainly before I do final paint. Otherwise, there's really not a lot to report about the assembly of this lower wing. This is just wonderful Tamiya engineering. Everything just really goes together here really nicely, and it's just it's just a giggle a minute when you're doing it, because it is just so smooth and so easy. Now, one thing that you have to do when you're putting this together, before you're putting it together, is they've done this silly undergating thing, whatever you want to call it, where the sprue gate extends to the actual mating surface. And you can see that sticking up there, and obviously we have to deal with that first before putting the wing together. And how I do that is just whip out my trusty Gundam Planet nippers, and the fact that they are a single-sided nipper and do such a great job of cutting close is why I can achieve that with these nippers. And I was just reading a thread on Facebook yesterday about nippers, and those threads always make me laugh, because I really feel like that there's the objection about cost, because these are not inexpensive. I mean, God hands are like $50. These were like $35. Can't even get these anymore, but Dispier makes some really nice ones. Ming makes some. I think Mr. Hobby is even making some. But I mean, if you can, but you can't even get past the price argument with a lot of dudes, because they will say, well, I just use side cutters and they work fine. Never had a problem. Well, yeah, no. And I think that a lot of guys just really don't understand how nipper blades work, and so they don't understand why this single blade style is better. So let's talk for a second about the physics of nipper blades. All right, if you've got a side cutter, and let me just grab one out of my drawer here, what you basically have is a pair of sharpened wedges. And you can see that pretty readily with these standard side cutters. See that? 2 wedges. All right. So what happens is when you've got a gate, all right, and you cut it with said sharpened pair of wedges, all right, this is the gate material here. Okay, so what happens is as you squeeze your cutter and you've got force going this direction, the wedges basically are trying to force this part of the material and this part of the material apart. So you introduce a tensile force here, call it Ft. And what that's doing is in this zone right here, it's basically stretching the material. Okay, so if your cutting force, call that Fc, all right, if your cutting force is less than your tensile force, what's going to happen? This is going to snap. It's going to stretch and deform, and then it's ultimately going to snap. And that's part at least of the noise that you hear when you cut a sprue and it's deforming. And that's also why your little tiny part goes catapulting across the room, because you've essentially been putting spring force on that joint, and when it finally goes, it launches. Okay, and you can see perfectly exactly what I'm illustrating there. Okay, all of that white there is stressed and stretched material, and you can see the little titty that's left from where it stretched and ultimately broke from that tensile force. Okay, so that is what's happening with a standard side cutter. Now, let's say you graduate to something like this pair of Zurons. Okay, that is still 2 sharpened wedges coming at each other, and you're still going to be doing the same thing. Now, it may be not as bad because these wedges are not as thick and they're a little bit sharper, but still, okay, that's why the part goes flying off into Never Never Land. It's a better cut than the other one, because the more obtuse the angle of the wedge is, the more force you apply, and so when it finally snaps, yeah, it's going to be worse. But still, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Now, the deal with the single blade and anvil style cutter, which is what you've got going on here, these look from a distance like they are also 2 sharpened wedges, but they're not. If you look on this side and you look close enough, you can see that's actually a flat face. It's not a cutting surface. That's the anvil. It's only that very thin blade, which is a very thin wedge, that is actually doing any cutting. And same thing, and people say don't cut sprues, don't cut all the way through a sprue with these, whatever, hogwash. I use my tools, and when they stop working good, I replace them. So there we go. See that? Just falls off because we're not generating that wedge force. Yeah, there's still a little bit of deformation or a little bit of discoloration or whatever you want to call it, but you've got that nice clean cut. And it's because the physics are completely different with the single blade and anvil style. How so? All right, so now when you have the single blade and anvil thing, what's happening is you've got your wedge coming in here like this. Obviously not that obtuse, unless it's just a really terrible pair of cutters. But your sprue material is like this now. Okay. Obviously you don't have any cutting going on here because you're just holding it against this flat surface while you cut this way. So what happens is the wedge effect is still happening. All right, you're still generating a force in this direction, but instead of stretching right here, what you're doing is bending it like this. Okay, so now because you're bending it a little bit more, it's much less force. It's much less likely to go popping off of there and flying across the room before you actually finish the cut, because it isn't really resisting you. So this bending force here is always going to be less than this cutting force here, and it lets you complete the cut before the actual damage occurs the way that it does over here. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense. That's the basic physics of how nippers work and why, even at the price that they are, that a single blade and anvil style cutter is always going to perform superior to any kind of side cutters, no matter whether they come from Snap-on or the dollar store. Okay, so one of the most critical things with any aircraft model is obviously the wing root. And I want to check that fit before I go any further. So, sorry, I had to plug the camera in there. So what I'm going to do is I've got this thing just taped together here, and I'm going to stick it on the bottom of this and see how things go. And what you're supposed to do is drop it in the back here and then just hinge it forward, and hopefully it's all good. Now this is especially important with a Spitfire. Hopefully my clumsy ass can actually hold this together long enough to draw some conclusions. That's one of the biggest challenges for me with dry fitting. If the parts won't hold themselves together, it's... Okay, so as usual with Spitfire models, what they've tried to do is put the wing joint, the wing root joint, along an existing panel line. And obviously what you hope for is that you don't have to do any sort of filling or any kind of body work at all, and you just get to work with that panel line, because obviously that's a challenge to not only get smoothed out, but then you have to worry about rescribing and re-riveting afterwards if it's not perfect. And you can see that this is pretty damn close. I mean, as long as you press it forward and it's completely seated, that's as perfect a joint as you're ever going to get. So I feel really good about that. I think, however, that what I'm still going to do is I'm probably going to glue the lower portion of the wing in, and then come back and put the upper portion of the wing on, just to make double certain that that joint is as tight as it can be. And I think that will work. Let me see if I can take this off of here. That may not work. Nah. Well, I guess you could, maybe, but you would have to remove that alignment pin that's down in there to be able to do that. And I may just do that. That's a pretty straightforward thing. That's not really going to screw up the alignment of the two wing halves, because you've got multiple pins, and really you need them to be able to scoot around just a little bit to make sure that they will press firmly up against the fuselage right there along that line. So I'll report back after I've done that. But in the meantime, that won't be until tomorrow, because in the meantime it's time for some sprue goo. Okay, so I want to use the minimum amount possible, and I want it to be pretty thin. I like to keep it mixed up in the jar thin enough that it's not stringy, and that's the minimum amount of thinness. Okay, see, I can pull it out of the jar and it doesn't really get too stringy, and that's what I want. And I find that occasionally I have to add a little more extra thin to the bottle, because there will be a little bit of evaporation, but that's how I like it. Now, my sprue goo recipe is tamiya sprue, Hasegawa sprue. Both of those are pretty hard, and I want the material to be as close to native as possible, and sprue goo is always going to be a little bit softer. But what I'm going to do on my next batch is I'm going to make it with clear sprue, because the native chemical state for polystyrene is clear. And as we all know, that's pretty hard and brittle, and I think that might actually make the best sprue goo. And then of course I'll add some lacquer paint to it like I've done with this, so that you can actually see it better. But what you can see that I'm doing here is I'm adding some extra thin, because I want it to be extra thinner, and the reason is because this is especially important with a really tight joint. I want to make sure that this stuff is going to settle into a really small gap, and it needs to be thin for that. So, and if it's a little thinner than it needs to be, no big deal, because it thickens up so quickly that you won't have to wait long. Now, here's something else that I've started doing, is priming the joint with pure extra thin. Don't get crazy, because you don't want it running everywhere. But the reason that I'm doing this is because I want to make double certain that the sprue goo really welds itself into that joint, and that little bit of priming will ensure that happens. And you can see also that I'm applying it with a toothpick, so that I am only using as much as is necessary. Because it really, I mean, you think about that joint that I'm trying to work. Okay, sorry, I had a little technical issue there, namely my camera card getting full. I don't know how that would ever happen with my videos being so short and all. But yeah, that's okay, because really all I want you guys to see is the end result, and where I've applied all this and obviously stuck my finger in it or something right there. I need to go back and deal with that. That's not a problem. because it's not dried yet. So just smooth that out with a little bit of extra thin. And as long as it's still in the gap, that's all I really care about. But you can see the point being that I've barely used any. Very, very small amount, just enough to ensure that that gap is filled. And so tomorrow I will come back and get to work with dressing all that down and then do some spot priming. And then it'll be time to, hopefully it won't take long, and then it'll be time to add the wings, and this thing is going to start moving a lot faster. Okay, so there you go. That gets us up to the point where I can do what I call the finish body work. And that's what we'll see in the next segment. And as always, I hope you'll stay tuned. And I appreciate you watching. Much love.